Psychomotor stimulants. All right, so you see on this slide, we've just got a lot of different psychomotor stimulants listed here. You'll see among them caffeine, our last chapter. You'll see nicotine, which we've already talked about. NoDoz, which contains caffeine, caphedrin, which is related. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about cocaine, we're going to talk about amphetamine, and then Ritalin, of course, is an amphetamine-derived drug. Methamphetamine, also related. Phentermine. You should also recognize that in low doses, at low doses, alcohol has stimulant properties. But remember that the drugs that we've just more recently talked about, caffeine, nicotine, those are also psychomotor stimulants. Okay. Here's just a little bit about some of the naturally occurring psychomotor stimulants and some of those that are synthetic. Okay, so ephedrine is from the herb ephedra. It has properties that are similar to epinephrine. Ephedrine used to be used in a lot of weight loss medications, but there were a lot of cardiac incidents related to its use in those weight loss medications. And so if you pay attention to some of the ads that are out for weight loss medications, etc., you'll see that they're very careful and deliberate to say does not contain ephedra or now ephedra free. Okay, and so they really make a point of letting folks know that those weight loss supplements don't contain ephedrine. Cocaine is made from the leaves of the coca tree. Okay, and this is what we'll spend a lot of time in this chapter talking about, cocaine, and then some time with amphetamine, of course. And then you have cathinone, which is called cat. Sometimes it's also been referred to as meow, or one of the synthetic forms of this. This drug used to be popular, not here in the U.S., because the leaf, and this drug is just not very stable in terms of transport, but you, in the UK and so forth, you do see some synthetic forms of this that are available. But also, it's a dangerous drug. Excuse me. Some of the synthetic psychomotor stimulants include amphetamines. Amphetamines were made actually as an alternative to ephedrine. Way back when, there were some fears that, and this is before the use in well, not really before the use in the weight loss medications, but there was some fear that they'd run out of ephedrine, and so this synthetic form, amphetamines, were developed, and the amphetamines in some cases replaced the ephedrine in some of the weight loss supplements. And one of the things that we'll talk about in just a bit as well is that, there are still prescription weight loss aids that contain the amphetamines. Excuse me. And then methamphetamine is an amphetamine derivative, methylphenidate as well. We will just briefly mention methamphetamine at a point later in the chapter. There's not a lot of time dedicated to it here. Nasty thing. And then methylphenidate, that is the generic name. Okay, you may be familiar with Ritalin. Okay, so that is an ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, attention deficit disorder medication. Okay, a little bit on the history. So in terms of its use in South America, some of the native tribes, some of the tribal rites chew on the, during the tribal rites, excuse me, they chew on the coca leaf. Okay. And so here I'm just doing, I'm not going to test you on the history. These are just little interesting factoids. Freud was one of the first to, uh, I guess, appreciate some of the potential medical uses of cocaine. He thought it'd be useful in treating addictions and in treating depression. And so he recognized the stimulating properties, the euphoria, the ability to elevate mood. Okay, now it's also true that cocaine was once an ingredient in Coca-Cola. So you'll see Coca-Cola. The coca leaf is part of the formulation and how Coca-Cola used to be made years and years and years and years and years and years and years ago. It's been a very long time since cocaine was actually removed. But the coca leaf was part of the formulation. Nowadays, the coca leaf is still used. Cocaine is extracted from the leaf. The cocaine is sent to federally regulated facilities in the U.S. And then the coca leaf, which is cocaine free, is sent to various plants, not just Coca-Cola, but various soda beverage distributing companies that use the coca leaf in their product. And then if you remember from our chapter on caffeine, the caffeine that's in soda is derived from the cola nut. Okay, so you got Coca-Cola. Some little bit of interesting history behind Coca-Cola. During, I guess, the height of segregation, so forth. And African Americans were not allowed to drink Coca Cola. They could choose any drink from the ice box, is what they called them in the South. A grape, a strawberry soda, an orange soda, but they could not have Coca Cola. And people were literally addicted to Coca Cola. They had to have these drinks. And then, of course, when it was realized how addictive cocaine was, the cocaine was removed from the formulation. Okay. Or at least that's part of the lure. Okay. So we'll put that disclaimer there. Karl Kahler, who is a German dentist, recognized the local anesthetic properties of cocaine. So cocaine is not only a psychomotor stimulant, but it also has local anesthetic effects. And so there are some drugs that are used as local anesthetics that are related to cocaine. And even though many of those drugs do not produce euphoria or rewarding or stimulating effects, the last part of that cane usually remains as part of their naming. Okay, so when you think about going to the dentist, lidocaine, novocaine, provocaine, those things with those local anesthetic properties are related. Okay. So I think I already jumped ahead just a little bit about amphetamine and telling you why it was originally developed. It was originally developed to replace ephedrine in some of those weight loss aids and supplements. Okay. So I'm gonna kind of combine some of the past legal and current legal uses of amphetamine, because there's some things. Well, let's talk about the past uses that are no longer legal, and then I'll let you know about the current legal uses, if some of those are older. Okay, so some of the things that amphetamine were used for that it's no longer used for. Amphetamines used to be prescribed for treatment of depression. And they also used to be prescribed for housewives as a pick-me-up. Okay, now it's just the way that society was, that you have a housewife who maybe has a young child in the home, and she needs to be able to cook, clean, watch the child, and have dinner on the table by the time her husband gets home from work. And so the amphetamines were often prescribed to give these women the boost of energy that they would need to get all of these things done. Okay, but that's just the way history is. So that was one of the two of the past things that the amphetamines were used for. Some of the other things that it's used for, we've already said that it was originally developed to replace ephedrine in some of those weight loss aids. And I've already said that, you can still get by prescription weight loss aids that contain amphetamine. Okay, and so that's something that has persisted. One of the other things that's persisted is the use of amphetamines in the treatment of narcolepsy. So the stimulant properties would prevent that sudden falling asleep. Okay, so we've got the weight loss aids, and then we've got narcolepsy. The other thing in terms of legal uses of amphetamines is for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and attention deficit disorder. That the amphetamine and amphetamine-related drugs are used in the treatment of ADD and ADHD. Okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about what the psychomotor stimulants have in common. Okay? They all affect transmission at what we call monoamine synapses. Okay, so what are the monoamines? This is a list of neurotransmitters that are considered monoamines. We sometimes also refer to these as catecholamines. Serotonin gets lumped in here. It's an indolamine, but we're talking about dopamine, and you should know that dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter that's associated with the reward system, with the limbic system. Remember, we talked about the mesolimbic dopamine system. We've got epinephrine. Remember, that's also known as adrenaline. We've got norepinephrine, which is also known as noradrenaline. And then we've got serotonin. So collectively, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, serotonin, those are referred to as monoamines. Okay, and so one of the notations you'll see that I have here, what is the major role of epinephrine? Okay, remember that epinephrine is the primary substance that's involved in the fight-flight response. Okay, and so when an individual takes psychomotor stimulants, okay, you have the release, or that it causes the release of epinephrine. So the psychomotor stimulants are sometimes referred to as sympathomimetics. Okay, why? Well, let's break this down. Sympathomimetics. This last part, mimes, mimics. Sympatho. This is talking about the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, epinephrine is the major substance that's associated with activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So the psychomotor stimulants are referred to as sympathomimetics because they mimic activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay? And remember, the psychomotor stimulants also include the caffeine, also include nicotine. Okay? And remember, when we talk about activation of the fight-flight response, you always want to keep this in mind when we talk about what the psychomotor stimulants have in common. They all activate that fight-flight response, the sympathetic nervous system, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased respiration, diversion of blood flow away from the digestive processes into the large muscle groups. Okay? Now, here we'll get into our general scheme, where we do administration, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, and general effects. Okay, we'll try to stick to that. There are a few areas in the chapter. We're going to separate some of the discussion of cocaine and some of the discussion on amphetamine, and so we'll cover cocaine, and then we'll go back and pick up amphetamine. And then a little bit later, we're going to have different categories of effects that we'll talk about. Okay. So again, remember we already mentioned that in South American Indians, what chew on the coca leaf is part of tribal rituals. And then, of course, in this case, the cocaine is absorbed through the mucous membranes of the mouth. But one of the things that we need to mention here is that cocaine is a very weak base. Okay, and so to prevent ionization, what happens is that lime, not the fruit, but the base lime, powdered lime. Okay, this is what's often used in pickling. If you're from the South, or if you like to uh, canned vegetables. I was searching my vocabulary. I couldn't think of it. If you've ever canned vegetables or had relatives that do, lime, okay, not the fruit, but lime, powdered lime, is something, it's a powder that's alkaloid, basic, is often used in that canning process, depending on what it is that you are canning. But that lime, okay, that alkaloid or basic substance will be added to the coca leaf and chew on it to prevent the ionization of the cocaine and to facilitate absorption through the membranes of the mouth. Okay? Cocaine used to be injected. Okay, of course, the advantage of the injection route is that it gets in, it's immediately in the bloodstream, so the effect is experienced very quickly, doesn't last long. Okay, injections of cocaine are, however, no longer very common, and this is one of the oddities about cocaine. If you had powder cocaine, add some liquid to it, uh, suck it up in a syringe and inject it. That the injections are no longer very popular or very common, because of the high risk of communicable diseases. And we're going to see that, later on when we talk about some other classes of drugs, that doesn't seem to be the case for some other types of drugs. And so, it tells us a little bit about the abuse potential for drugs in certain forms, etc., and what's considered risky, not risky. Okay? Uh, and so the injections are no longer very common because of the high risk of communicable diseases. But as we're going to see in just a bit, there are different forms of cocaine, okay, less risky in terms of the risk of disease and greater reward, okay, greater reward potential there, okay. You have intranasal administration of cocaine. Sniffing or snorting powder cocaine is sniffed or snorted into the nostrils. Cocaine would be absorbed then through the mucous membranes of the nasal passages. It's going to be about 30 minutes or so. I don't test you on those exact numbers. 30 minutes or longer before the blood levels peak. Okay, and one of the things to understand here is that cocaine has vasoconstrictive properties. The blood vessels constrict. Okay, and because it has these vasoconstrictive properties of cocaine, it means it's going to slow down the rate of absorption of cocaine. If you slow down the absorption, it's going to delay the onset of effects. Okay, so cocaine constricts the blood vessels, which slows the absorption, which delays the onset of effects, okay? Which is why it takes so long for the blood levels to peak, okay? Now, one of the things that we also have to consider here is the long-term effect of cocaine's vasoconstrictive properties on the nose, okay? For an individual who continues to sniff and snort cocaine, and for these blood vessels in the nasal passages to be constricted, in a chronic fashion, that could eventually lead to deviated septum. And people go, wait a minute, yes, it leads to a deviated septum, a hole in the septum. Okay, so it leads to what we call necrosis or tissue death, because you constrict blood flow. Okay, you constrict the blood vessels. It means that you're constricting blood flow to tissue, and if there's no blood flow to the tissue, then the tissue is going to die. Okay, and this is why you end up with holes in the septum, because you have the death of tissue. Okay, these are some other forms of cocaine administration. And one of the things that I want to point out right now, when we talk about injecting cocaine, when we talk about sniffing or snorting cocaine, we're talking about powder, the powder form of cocaine. Okay, and so unless I say otherwise, we're just talking about the powder form of cocaine. Okay, I say that because when we talk about freebasing and crack on this slide, then we're altering that powder form slightly. But everything that we've talked about so far, powder cocaine. Okay, so in terms of smoking cocaine, tooting. Okay, this is simply where powder cocaine is either heated on a piece of aluminum foil or on a spoon. Okay, that's heated, and then the individual inhales the vapors, okay, from that heated cocaine. Okay, and so not only with cocaine, but with some other drugs as well, when individuals do things like this and they're inhaling the smoke and the vapors, the little wisps of smoke that are coming up off of these spoons or the foil, this is where terms like chasing the dragon, uh, came into play, because the individual, is trying to inhale all of the little wisp of smoke. And so it almost seems like with their noses that they're chasing these wisp of smoke to make sure they inhale as much of this as they can. Okay. Then we've got freebasing. Okay. Now, this is powder cocaine, but the individual adds a very combustible substance to it. Sometimes it's a battery acid or something else that's highly combustible. Okay, so freebasing. Why are you adding something that's highly combustible? Something that's highly combustible is going to produce a heat that is much hotter, a heat that's at a much, much higher temperature than if a person were simply tooting. So with freebasing, you're adding this highly combustible substance to the cocaine. You're heating this cocaine up to very, very high temperatures, and those high temperatures are literally going to free the cocaine base from the other impurities. And so the individual is able to achieve a higher high because the cocaine base, that molecule, remember cocaine is a weak base, that base has been freed from the other things that might be chemically attached to it. Okay, freebasing. Freebasing, uh, a lot of talk about freebasing occurred in the 70s, I would say. You may have heard of Richard Pryor, who was a stand-up comedian. Um, Freebasing gained a lot of popularity after he had quite an horrific accident related to freebasing cocaine, where he set himself on fire and ended up in the hospital quite a while with some pretty significant second and third degree burns, lots of third degree burns. So it was not a good thing, because the substances that are used uh, in freebasing are very, 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 very dangerous. And so he essentially set himself on fire. But he was able to profit from that in his stand up career, because he, in the time after his recovery, many of his routines were, making fun of himself and how he had set himself on fire. Not that it's a funny topic, but he profited from, a really bad misfortune. Okay. Then we've got crack cocaine. Okay. With crack cocaine, this is where the powder cocaine, you're adding baking soda. And so, as strange as it seems, there's a song that's out that, is pretty accurate, but it's baking soda added to powder cocaine. The substance is wetted, okay, or moistened, okay. That produces a paste. That paste is then either allowed to dry, and when it dries, it clumps, and those form the crack rocks. Some people speed that drying process along by doing what they call baking it, okay? But you've got powder cocaine, you've got baking soda, you add moisture to it, that creates a paste, and then you let that paste dry, and the clumps that are formed are the crack rocks that people then smoke. Okay, so by adding the baking soda, which is basic, okay, to the powder cocaine, when you then burn that, okay, it's something that's more lipid soluble, okay, than just powder, than if it were just powder cocaine by itself, okay. And so the other thing that I need to mention here with tooting, freebasing, crack, smoking, these are various forms of smoking cocaine, but in these cases, the cocaine is getting to the brain. The individual is getting high within a matter of seconds or a matter of minutes, and the high doesn't last very long. And so for these forms of administration, and particularly for crack, uh, considered to have a higher abuse potential, higher abuse liability than, for example, powder cocaine, because these forms of cocaine are all, or smoking, freebasing, or if you have it changed, altered in this form of crack, are more lipid soluble. So the cocaine is getting into the bloodstream much more rapidly. The effects don't last long. So you see where we're going? So it's packing a punch. The effects don't last long. So the individual is more likely to use it. Remember, the rate of tolerance depends on the dose and the time between doses. And so when you're freebasing or you're smoking crack and your high only lasts you 45 seconds, then you can understand how these drugs are, or in these forms, easily abused. Okay. We're going to stop there, and I'll come back with the distribution and excretion.